some of us here have just come through a series of events in which Lyn has been both figuring highly and very generous. So she's given 2 keynote addresses at conferences. One was on the relationship between what Lyn calls the over-signifying poetics of the Occupy movement, very political, very vital, and how that crossed with 19th century figurations of romance and revolution through the work of Victor Hugo, particularly the character Gavroche and the interpretation of poetical ditty in that. It was absolutely fabulous paper. Then she moved to a discussion of contemporary allegory and something that Lyn is talking about in a new work called wild captioning. And this brought up a big discussion about the notion of the wild, the notion of the feral or the errant work pointing to texts without ever pointing, and some very vital issues around landscape, the pastoral, and also the political undertaking. I think these are really great backgrounds to this. One thing that occurred to me was that, I was just speaking with Andy about this earlier, poetic form itself has rarely been mentioned as such excitingly in the last week. I've heard almost no one say poetic form. What we have spoken about is the wild caption, the allegory, the challenge, the crush. And I was really interested in this idea of where form has gone in a bigger discourse about the innovation. We had words like rhapsody, ekphrasis, aggregation, agglutination. And this is so thrilling. Yesterday, Lyn, someone talked about post-conceptualism, and you said, I'm so glad we're post that already. I'm glad that form has moved on. So I guess I'm interested in this, the schooling or the disciplining of work into a kind of formal likeness, and the way you radically resist that, and also historically, politically, there's an always already to form that for me is very, very exciting in what's been going on here. So that's an entry to
the next hour, yes?
Yes, to the next hour.
Well, I think that part of the beginning of a response is the quite obvious one that will be familiar to most, if not all of you, which is the way that in English language the term form suggests something static. That's like, the glass, and then you fill it. The glass is the form, and then the water is the poetry, and you plop it into the glass, and then you've got your poem. I think that, and that's just the way that the English language for some way is so noun-based and imagines the world as having a kind of fixity of givens or things in it. Much more productive, I think, is to imagine the term form as synonymous with force, that a form is a kind of engine. And in fact, a number of people associated with language writing, as with the conceptualists, post-conceptualists, and of course many other schools and non-schools, anti-schools, is to think about what your work's going to look like, how you're going to organize it, because the options are virtually limitless. And you've got an impulse to get going, whether you know what you're going to go about or go after or not. And it can be very useful to think of kinds of constraints, rules of writing that can tell you how to shape it. And those have been incredibly productive. And the trick, as one launches into a new work, is to think of a shape that in some way is going to further the project that you're embarking on, rather than curtail it or ossify it or misdirect it. And it's interesting, that is very much at the technical side. I think the 2 conferences the papers I heard, and I heard a lot of them, all of them at Sydney and a quarter of them or more at Melbourne, because there were 4 sessions at a time and I couldn't be at more than one at a time, not because I bailed for 75% of the time, were about theory, like philosophical, social, cultural forces that are in play at this moment. And I think that is entirely justified, even though most of the people at the conferences were makers, were themselves creative writers, or were interested in as readers in what it is that's been made here. Like, how does this car work? Nonetheless, one of the themes that has been recurrent and urgent is the fact that so many of us, maybe all of us I hear, feel that we're living in a time of terrific political, social, cultural, economic, and environmental crisis. We're in an emergency. And so to talk about, how many stresses before you make a line break seems at the moment to be peripheral to the major conversation that needs to be engaged in. If we had like a year all in this room, like we occupy the building, and we could talk about all of these issues, and then we could also talk about how many stresses or beats in a line before the line break, or we could argue about it or whatever. But I think that's one reason that form just didn't come up, although I could be completely wrong, but I think it wasn't like the thing of the moment. Okay, second thing that occurred to me as you were asking that question is a kind of what I have experienced as two impulses. Now that I'm a truly proper professor in a truly proper academic situation, and I really love it. And I love the kinds of scholarly, critical work that my colleagues and students do. There's a real draw to interpretation. And I believe all creative writing is also interpretive in some way. It makes inquiry, it's investigative, it maps, it wanders, etc. But the academic is apt to want to categorize, etc. And some of that can be interesting, but I think it's terrifically dangerous. So one of the things that I keep thinking about is how to be an interpretive thinker who isn't a terminal thinker. That doesn't say we're going to slot these 4 writers into the post-conceptualist school, and these into the anti-lyric tradition, and this little cluster over here is the epic narrators. It's just bogus. Yeah. But you do see dissertations like that, the naming or. So I think that's a kind of canon formation or school formation that rhymes with poetic form, but I think it does the similar disservice to kind of ossifying. The names and labels of schools aren't important, but it's not the case that it's all just poetry. Like the vehemence with which people embrace their aesthetics and argue for them and theorize them and fight about them, there is a lot at stake. It doesn't not matter. And I don't know how exactly to articulate. I mean, at this time when the humanities more generally are under attack because it's impractical, useless, who cares? And then to say, avant-garde poetry that's it's got this is probably a large percentage of all of Australia who cares. But it's really worth caring about, even if it's only a few of us. And so it's not all just peaches and cream. I just wanted to make that clear. When I very sweetly say the labels don't matter, but the shit matters. Yeah. I became, as I said in one of the sessions, bewildered by what Walter Benjamin means when he uses the term allegorical or allegory. And especially an allegory, it seems that in some senses Benjamin sees the allegorical as that bit of material culture, whether it's actually a thing or an idea, as something that remains after everything else has been lost. So it's been decontextualized, and then the allegorical element in it, or the allegorical possibility of it, is to recontextualize it, repurpose it, re-mean it. And that seemed an extremely open-ended philosophical concept, or a philosophical concept about an open-ended relation to things, whether they're objects or ideas or events. And then I became decreasingly interested in the thing world, the object world, and increasingly interested in some notion of event. And at one point in some essay I wrote that the function of art is to say this is happening, which is related to the experience this, but it announces it slightly different as a moment rather than a thing, and an event rather than, or an occasion or a context. And I like that because things tend to have more literal solidity and stability than an event. Like, this is going to end, and it will never happen again, but it is really happening now, for better or for worse. And that interests me, and especially because I'm interested in memory and how, again, how open-ended and repurposed that can become.
And I wonder,
Yeah,
how does event relate to or might it relate to a sense of repertoire? Because there's a repertoire of events that come around and around and around, and this is something that comes through the Book of a Thousand Eyes. And I felt that there was a lovely resonance going on from Saga Circus to Book of a Thousand Eyes, where the circus, in its many returns to chapter, is, you know, you're seeing both what you described as the three rings all happening simultaneously. You might be guided by a figure from one to another. But repertoire is something that hasn't always been discussed, I think, in terms of poetry. Music, it gets sort of sequestered into a world of music. But it strikes me that the many chapter returns of Saga Circus are spatiotemporally radical in a way that Septenza is within music, a repertoire. Because it's not just three events occurring simultaneously, it's the return of an event again and again and again. And it's also the fact
or a return to an event again and again.
If 1,000 eyes are watching the same event, it's happening 1,000 times at the least, at the very, very least. So I'd not really thought about the circus trope seriously until listening to you read this morning. And it occurred to me that as a fable of phenomenological duration, where time is not chronolinear but spatialized always, but also in the custody of many eyes, it's very powerful in that way. And I wondered if there's a sense in which you could speak to that. Or
the term repertoire completely surprises me, and I think it's magnificent. I mean, there's two ways I can think of it in terms of music. One, of course, is the set, the list of what you're going to play, and or in improvised music, like what configurations of musicians, like instruments, will happen, etc. But then there's also the personal riffs, like what you can do, and the musicians I know are always worried that they're going to keep falling back on their habitual riff. Like, I know I can really go up and down the saxophone. I can smoke that. But you can only do that so many times, and everybody says, there he goes again, up and then down. And so it becomes like shtick, which is different from repertoire and different from riff. And that is certainly something I think about in attempts not to fall onto riffs and to undercut myself. But that's not a really good answer to your question. And it's the return of an event, I think, is extremely interesting in everyday life, especially, like the event of brushing your teeth, as well as the event of being again crushed by some stupid political decision or judicial decision. And otherwise, I think like the thousand eyes looking at events, or the million eyes given the society of the spectacle kind of thing, I think that's really problematic and fascinating terrain. I mean, one is it's about relationships and relationality, and the urgency, the need for people and creatures, all creatures, I suppose. I'm really interested in this other creatures thing. Although we have 2 cats, and I really have tried to figure out like what they are thinking. And I mean, I've gotten on the floor and crawled and followed the cat's path and paused, and nothing. I don't hear what the cats hear. I don't know why they do that. Like, why when I put the bowl of water here on my desk, does the male cat go over there, around the room, along the wall, under the chair, jump onto this, and come over? He sees me put it there. He's asked for it. He's gone to the bathroom and gone, meow, meow, looked at the sink, and then. So I think there's a real requirement that we attempt to understand what the other eyes are seeing, and an absolute requirement that we don't attempt it.
Right.
That we don't like claim other people's experience by saying, oh, I see what you see. We don't. And there's one way in which to establish like camaraderie, solidarity, a sense of being in this in common. And then the other is like leaving other creatures' spaces alone. So that's a subtle one to. Yeah. I think you have to just do both. Yeah. Like that's, again, about going back to categories. Like it's not an either or. It's like that we do both.
I might ask you about sort of a historical note now to bring a couple of other works of Lyn's into the room before we invite everybody into the room. And it's the grand piano experiment and collective autobiography, which many of you will know. It's a very recent, an ongoing or completed now, but undertaking by various poets and writers who were involved in those early days of language poetry. And there's an essay, your essay in number 7, which is to do with music. I've come to this through repertoire. Talks about the late 1960s, early 1970s in San Francisco in particular, in relation to scenes of innovation in other art forms. And one thing that I was just reminded of, I'd forgotten, was that Terry Riley was there at that time.
Still is around.
Still is, cracking out in C, I think it was, and other extraordinary works of improvisation, spatiotemporal collapse, inquiry. There's a sense of abandon to that work. And it made me think of the impossibility of the school that you were talking about before, the impossibility of dividing these art forms and practices from one another in some kind of way. So through the trope of playing the grand piano and through the musicality of that, there's a recognition of that in common that you were just talking about, that these ideas, formations, I'm hesitant to say forms, allegories, rhapsodies, can be shared in common despite the exquisite particularity of every single note that's being sounded within. And I wanted to step past that in a way back to this idea of the place of country, because we have Deborah Bird-Rose with us this morning, which is a wonderful conjunction. Both Deborah and Lyn spoke together in Melbourne. And your kind of step there toward the creaturely. And so I just wanted to bring this idea of the landscape, the ruined pastoral that we've been speaking about, into the conversation, and wonder how you're thinking through that, not just after the last week, but in relation to your work. There's a huge amount of ecology, creatureliness in the Book of 1,000 Eyes, which perhaps isn't foregrounded as much in earlier works. I wonder where you are with that.
Maybe a better place, I'll get to the grand piano, but I think that has to do with geopolitical place rather than ecological landscapes. I mean, culture is ecological, obviously, but there's a kind of Northern California versus East Coast dynamic that is real but maybe shouldn't be as important as it gets taken to be, that I'll try to think and talk about in a minute. The creaturely thing actually came about because at some point in a class, I heard myself saying that it's possible for writers to cross-dress. In fact, that's what you do when you're writing. You cross-dress, because you don't write as yourself. I don't write as myself. And then I thought, wow, that's good. That's my friend Charlie Altieri often will be like at a social gathering or a place like that, and he'll or a place like this, and then he'll say something. He'll say, "Oh, that's good," and he'll get out his notebook and write down what he's just said. He's really impressed himself. So that I had one of those moments in which I said, one of the things that writing could do is allow for cross-dressing. And I thought, wow, that's good. And then I went home and thought, well, why not write as a duck? And then Tolstoy's story that I think the title gets translated as Yardstick or Black Beauty. Anna Sewell's book was maybe more familiar. But Tolstoy writes a short story from the point of view of a cart horse who thinks humans are very odd, that they see the world through language. It's clearly not. That's not what the world's about. Anyway, so I was playing with that a lot, and it really was a trope. Obviously, I was not writing as a duck, or actually a goose, because of Mother Goose. It's a whole other train of thought. But it does relate, the Mother Goose, it does relate to my being very interested in fairy tales and narratives, and the kinds of stories that people tell about themselves, and kinds of self-mythologizing that goes on as people get asked to tell about themselves. We have a now quite famous musician friend who won a very, very prestigious award and was interviewed on NPR, National Public Radio. And I've known him for 40 years. I've been in his apartment in New York many, many times. And the interviewer asks him about his daily life, and he says, fuck, I live in a little tiny place. My clothes are in a cardboard box. I live simply, man. Like, it's about the music, man. And he's got an art collection to kill for. And it is true that his clothes are in a cardboard box. But the myth that he was projecting of, I live very simply, I just work on my music, man. The rest is fucked, man. It's like, whoo. And I said, Larry, listen to X. He's got 3 Joseph Cornell boxes. But that's a story, and it's actually a good story for him to tell, because it is useful for young admirers that hear it and aren't thinking what fame means is that you live the star's life and live in a mansion. You keep your clothes in a cardboard box. And
it's kind of a fable for now.
Yeah. So that's like the species thing. I think that an element of the grand piano, a very strong thread that runs through it and that is sometimes articulated and explicit and often not, is telling the story. And not all the stories are exactly the way everyone remembered them. And some of the dynamics of composition, so the way, and I want to give Barrett Watton enormous credit for dreaming up the form, designing the books, and often, although he would be angry at me for saying this because it makes him sound like a certain kind of person, cracking the whip to keep everybody doing it. And there were a few people, 3 in particular, that really did need a lion tamer to keep them on task. I was not one of those people, but sometimes I wished I could be. But the process was that we would all, there was some general theme that would get proposed and argued about. We had and we still have it, a closed listserv for the 10 of us, the 10 authors, plus one person who was invited to Alan Bernheimer to be an author and said there was no way he could invest in, commit to that. But he did write one of the essays about a wonderful filmmaker who died of AIDS, Warren Sonbert, and there's a tribute to him in one of the issues. But we would all send drafts of our one essay, so there's 10 volumes. Each of the 10 people write an essay loosely about the theme that's been settled on, or refusing to, which is a way of doing the theme without doing the theme. And then all the other 9 would critique it. And there would be raging arguments. This was often not a friendly process, and definitely not like nourishing and supportive, unless you could take argument and contention to be that. And often it can be, but but it remained the fact that this account is 10 different accounts, and it's 10 different accounts thematized. And it became, at the reception of the grand piano, as the little books came out, on the East Coast became quite sardonic in many cases. And people would make comments about, oh, they've got a grand piano, well, I've just got a harmonica. And the audience would all go, we're so cool, we just have harmonicas. And those people in San Francisco think they've got a grand piano. It was the name of the club, the cafe, where we did a lot of the readings in the early days. That's the title. It wasn't in order to aggrandize our orchestral production. I think ultimately, like a lot of us, as it happens, are in fact from California, which is quite odd or rare in California as a place to which, as the sort of final frontier, and Hollywood and now Silicon Valley, it's a place to which people have come from the East and from the East. But as it happens, I think everybody that contributed was born in California. Does that, I don't know if there's a cultural thing that suffuses one's consciousness.
It's sort of displaced and relocated every time. And these essays, I mean, there are 10 of you writing 10 essays on themes, but there are 9 hyper-critiques of every single essay as it's coming out. The very idea of the grand piano exhausts me, and it must have exhausted you in some degree, but it also proliferates in the way that the Scheherazade story does, because none of the stories will ever be told fully. They cannot be by fiat. I don't know if you're writing for your lives anymore, but there's a serious, I mean, I'm not just being flippant there, because of the political urgency, I think, of geopolitical projects of such scope.